Howdy folks, Tex Grebner here with Tex Grebner Outdoors. Just getting back to my hotel room after going to the ATA show. The ATA show is definitely a totally different animal than anything I've ever tried to tackle before in my whole life. It's at the end of the hunting seasons, so I'm going to take you back to the beginning. You see, my mother's name is Diana, and I was born under the sign of Curanos, the savage stag-faced god of the hunt to the Paleo-Celtic cultures. So I was born to be a hunter. So such is the way of our people since we first struck fire from living rock. Let me tell you a hunting story and take you all the way back to October. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. And sitting in my tree, I was reflecting on how different opening day is. Because opening day is the first time in a year that everything is fresh and new. And we as human predators get to enter the woods as not simple observers, but we actually get to enter the woods and do what comes naturally to us as humans. My opening day started out much rougher than I had intended for, as I had managed to lock myself out of my house while loading up my gear, which gave me a much later start than I had hoped for, and as I approached my stand, I managed to spook a doe out of my food plot. And so, with the wind on my neck, blowing its guts out, I sat and sulked, thinking, great, this is going to be another Tex Grebner comedy of errors of a deer season. What am I thinking? Why the hell am I even out here? But I still sat, sitting as still as I possibly could, and trying not to be depressed that I had busted a doe early in the morning. And there he was, with no warning other than a splash in the creek. I looked down and saw the glint of ivory antlers through the underbrush. I marveled at the beauty of this animal that did not know that I was there. He could smell deer because I had set out a trail's end scent dripper, but he could not see deer, and this young 6-point was very confused. With my bow resting on my knees and my cameras rolling, I watched him. I did not marvel in the joy of the impending kill. I did marvel in the majesty of this ghost of the forest. And still I sat and watched and waited. Ranging him with my eyes, he was obscured by a tree branch, and he was just outside of my comfort zone. I will not loose an arrow unless I am absolutely sure of the shot. And so as the sun rose a little bit higher, I continued to watch this confused young buck, wondering if he would step into my food plot and present me with a shot. When the buck turned his head, I moved my bow into a better position to be ready. Now, it's very difficult to shoot a recurve sitting down from a tree stand, but he stood like a statue, still obscured by the tree branch and still just outside of my comfortable shooting lane. I readied my bow camera just in case he came. He was watching and he was listening, and he was scenting the air. Something didn't seem quite right to him, but he was so confused. He could smell deer, he just couldn't see deer. and still as a statue he stood. And I had my eyes locked upon him. When his head turned again, I got into position, thinking that he would step into the food plot, waiting and hoping and praying to any god or gods that would listen to me at this moment. I readied myself for the impending moment of truth. And then I realized, what if my camera was not in position? Would I miss the film that I strived for in order to tell this hunting story? And so foolishly, I adjusted my camera, somehow managing not to spook the buck. My bow was in position, and still, like a statue, he stood, confused. I wished upon wish and hoped upon hope that he would step out from under the tree branch and present me with a shot. He was no monster trophy by any means, but this buck represented meat and life. I do not hunt simply for meat. I hunt for a holistic experience. I hunt to consume the experience, to consume the spirit, and to consume the strength through the meat of the animal in a holistic manner of hunting. But eventually this small buck lost interest, and that was my morning hunt of opening day. My evening hunt of opening day started out quite uneventfully. You see, with an evening hunt, you have so much daylight and so little mystery, and you want to get there in time to where you have a few hours before twilight to let the woods settle down. And then you are well placed when the deer become active. I had decided to fully commit to this hunt. However, my resolve was definitely challenged by the gale force winds that were causing my tree to sway so violently it was all I could do not to vomit while being tipped off of my platform. And so, while I was committed to the hunt, I decided to readjust my strategy for safety. I stalked through the undergrowth until I found a likely looking trail and a stump, and I proceeded to sit, watch, wait, and listen, and be excited and annoyed by the ever-present squirrels. The wind was swirling all around me, and in the daylight there is so little mystery. But I was waiting for twilight in hopes of intercepting the deer on their way to my food plot. However, finally, after several position changes, I decided to call it an evening.
Well, I'm hiked out. Nothing tonight at all. Saw a lot of squirrels. And I've still got a little bit of shooting light left. But completely honest with you, I don't like evening hunts, because if you take a shot in the evening, it makes the animal's recovery a lot more difficult. Make sure to stay tuned. It's about mid-morning, and I'm gonna try and put a stalk on a pocket jungle. Now, it's pretty foolish, to be honest with you, but he who dares wins. It is really windy, and I don't have time to hunt the morning, but I'm going to come up this hill here. See if I can sneak up on them in their beds.
Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. Today was interesting because it was mid-morning and I wanted to see if I could catch some deer in their beds. And so I was reminded as I crossed the open ground up the hill of hunters, time immemorial, and explorers being spurred on by wanderlust. What lies over the next ridge? Or fence in this case. Now out west, spot and stalk is a real thing. You spot your game and you stalk your game. In the Midwest, what we do, stalking whitetails, pretty much equates to jump shooting mallards, flushing them like pheasants. However, I moved closer to the bedding area in hopes of finding a mature buck in this almost inaccessible area. I scanned the terrain, trying to spot my quarry. I was excited, and yet my excitement was tempered with ever-present disappointment. The wind was perfect to cover not only my scent, but my noise. And yet everything was perfect except there were no game animals bedded around the pond. And so I made my way back out along the trail toward the fence, slightly dejected, but knowing that I had hunted. You cannot find your game if you are not in the woods.
Stalking whitetail in the Midwest borders on foolishness because either they are there or they aren't there. And in most cases, because the brush is so thick, you are not going to know they're there until you're already busted. In this case, the wind conditions were perfect for stalking because it's blowing its guts out, so it covered my sound as I moved, and it was blowing in my face when I came up the hill. So if there were deer bedded around the pond, they wouldn't have known that I was there. The trouble is, there weren't deer bedded around the pond, so it ended up being a fool's errand. But it's October 3rd. I'm Tex Grebner. Stay tuned, because I'm still hunting.
Every Midwestern whitetail hunter knows that perfect October morning. Overcast and calm and misty, chilly, but yet tolerable. We can feel it in our bones when everything is perfect, and it only needs one more ingredient: the mystical whitetail. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. And I sat, watching, waiting, listening, hoping, praying, and being both an observer and a participant in the dance of predator and prey, marveling at the majesty that was nature and creation, waiting for a quarry to step beneath my stand, for me to do what comes naturally to me. And yet, while everything else was perfect, the birds were singing, the squirrels were playing, I still waited, sitting as still as I could, on this, the perfect October morning, for a deer to walk beneath my stand. But what people fail to understand, for hunters, be it human or animal, the prey often gets away. But I felt uncheated because I had hunted. I had sat and I had watched and I had observed and absorbed and become one with nature on this morning. And so finally, it was time to get down. And yet, I would return. Just as it was the perfect morning for deer hunting, it was the perfect evening, and I could taste a quickening in the air and feel it in my bones. I knew that there would be deer movement tonight. All of you Midwestern deer hunters know exactly what I'm talking about. And so I made my way to my stand extra cautiously to make sure that if there was a deer in my food plot that I would not spook them. Once I was set up, I was flushed with excitement. It was slightly gusty, but mostly calm, and it had that wonderful, cool October evening feel. The squirrels were, of course, active, and I was doing my best not to fidget. Sitting, watching, waiting, listening. And then, magically, I had managed to ignore the fact that there was a doe feeding just across the property line behind me, straight up the end rows of the bean field across the fence. Now, while I could have slung an arrow, ethically and legally, unless I have permission to shoot across a property line, I will not. And so I simply watched the doe as she fed along and prayed that she would eventually cross the fence and head back this way. But it was absolutely fantastic and humbling to know that a deer had walked directly behind my stand within 10 yards, and that I had had no idea that it was even there. I sat, still watching and waiting, tense with anticipation, in case other deer would make their way toward the field past my stand across my property. I watched the corners of my field of view for any movement, moving as little as I possibly could, and hoping that the doe who had crossed into my property at the creek line would make herself present under my stand. But you never really know. Deer are beautiful, graceful, and mysterious creatures that have free spirits. And so I sat, anticipating, feeling the quickening in the air, as the dark mistress of night began to sweep down upon the timber, bringing with it her own mystery, and awaking all the little night noises that create the hunter's song. And still I watched, hopeful, as the moon began to rise, and the light faded faster and faster. At this point, I was questioning my ethics yet again. I do not like evening hunts in the sense that if you shoot a deer, they are difficult to recover. And so I had my bow at the ready if an opportunity presented itself. I sat in anticipation, waiting for one of these majestic creatures to pass in front of my stand. The darkness lengthened and the shadows grew. The evening was beautiful until finally I made the choice. I could not shoot in this light and then follow a blood trail.
That does it for shooting light tonight. Getting hiked out. Pretty cool to get to see that doe feeding out in the field. But I won't take a shot unless I'm sure of it. And I sure won't shoot across the property line. Not something I'm gonna do. So even if that doe stood right behind my stand and smiled at me, she was gonna keep on living. Pretty awesome night in the deer stand, to be honest with you. And I'm glad you guys are still watching to see this. So this here is Evercalm. Yep, I did it. And you may be saying, Tex, that's doe urine in wax. And I'll say, yeah. And you'll say, you could get attacked by a deer. Yeah, I know. I'm counting on it. You don't need a rangefinder when they're that close.
It was October 7th. It had been a very warm day, and I hadn't had a chance to hunt in the morning. And so as I made my way to my stand, I did not have high hopes. But yet the allure and mystery of the woods draws us, as hunters, into its power, as much as the taste of venison draws us into the woods. With my safety harness in order, I pulled up my bow, and I made myself ready, should an opportunity present itself. Now, I said that I didn't have very high hopes for this hunt, and that is true. But yet, I sat, watching, waiting, listening, because every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. You never know what you are going to encounter. You never know what you are going to see. Sitting as still as I possibly could, watching the ever-present squirrels in the clearing. The air was so still, and the wind was in my face, what little there was of it. I could hear the squirrels 50 yards away in the treetops chewing on the nuts. Every little creak in the fence behind me would tension my nerves. I watched the bean field out the corner of my eye, and I watched the underbrush. Everything was absolutely perfect as I sat in anticipation, with the sun dropping faster and faster and the air rapidly cooling. This could be the moment. This could be the moment of truth, where life and death hang in the balance. And yet, nothing except the beauty of nature and creation. The sun dropped further and further, and night began to envelop the woods. I knew that if something was going to happen, it had better happen fast, because I will not take a shot unless I am sure. And still the sun sank. The air remained calm, and everything was absolutely perfect as I sat, absorbing the experience. Perfectly content, but the shadows lengthened and the mystery grew. And off in the distant gathering darkness, my mind created the phantasmagoria. Visions of deer swirling in the back of my head. And yet, finally, as the sun sank further and further, I made the decision. It was time to get down.
Nothing tonight, but my God, I was blessed to be out in the woods tonight. Calm wind blowing in my face. Everything was perfect. Perfect weather, perfect temperature, perfect wind. Everything was perfect, and I got to experience it. So it really doesn't matter to me right now that I'm walking out without a deer. October only comes once a year. And if you've never experienced the Midwest from a deer stand in October, I hope you get the chance someday. Because it was one of the most beautiful nights that I have ever in my life sat in a deer stand.
I never sleep well before a morning hunt, and so I had been awake since about 2 in the morning, waiting, hoping, and plotting. As I always do, I tested my cameras, synced my remote, and made my way into the woods. However, every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. And while I made my way into the woods, there was a phantasmagoria in the darkness. My mind was creating images of swirling deer. And yet, when I reached my tree stand, as I climbed the ladder, I looked out into the field, and there were 2 does feeding in the picked beans. I managed to get into my stand without spooking them. And if you look just between my quiver and the tree, you can see one of the does feeding. Now you see, I am able to operate my bow cameras manually, but to reduce movement in the stand, I operate my 2 tree cameras by remote.
You've got to be kidding me. I get here. Does are in the field. I can't shoot that way, so it doesn't matter anyways. I tested my cameras before I got up here. Sun's up. I can't get my remote to work. I don't know if the battery's dead or what. But I gotta climb down and resync my remotes. Joy.
Every day in the woods is a brand new adventure. And filming a hunt adds an entirely new level of challenge. The remote was working fine for my plot camera. However, there was something out of sync with my stand camera. And so, I made my way back into my tree for the 3rd time.
Well, that's the 3rd time I've been up this tree this morning. But sometimes you have to suffer for your art.
Finally, everything was going according to plan. I had managed to not spook the deer in the field earlier in the morning, and while I did not have high hopes For the remainder of my hunt, I was determined that I was going to tell a hunting story today.
When I got here, there were 2 does feeding in the beans that had been picked. I managed to get into my tree without spooking them, and they ended up going off to their beds. I then tried to turn on my remote. Apparently my battery is low because it couldn't operate both cameras. So this is the 3rd time that I've been up this tree since dawn. If you're wondering why I'm doing the real tree whisper, it's because I'm almost positive I am not going to see shit today now that the sun is out, and I have completely fuckered up my hunt. But that is the price that I am willing to pay in order to tell a hunting story.
Despite the frustrations of the early morning, I still remained in my stand, watching, waiting, listening, and hoping that the bedded does might come to my food plot. I've been told many times, you know why you don't kill deer, Tex? Because you film your hunts. If you didn't worry about your cameras, then you could kill a mess of deer. And to be completely honest with you, I understand, and that's the truth. But anyone that hunts on film will tell you there's no point in simply killing the animal. We are there in order to bring a hunting story back to the campfire. And so that is why I do what I do. I am not afraid to show you my failures and my flaws, because in the end, adversity enhances triumph. Time moved on, and it was apparent that I would not be getting a deer today, and so my hunt came to a close. I made my way down from my tree, and yet I would return. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. My hands burnt from the steel spikes I had climbed up to my stand. It was the first frost of the year. I had ordered a decoy to put in my food plot, and there was a quickening in the air, and I knew that there would be deer movement today. They could not avoid moving in the daylight with the drop in the temperature. They would have to move to find food and to warm themselves in the sun and shift their bedding areas. I sat watching, waiting, and listening, sometimes being startled by my own decoy in the food plot. I eventually stopped paying attention to the squirrels as they were constantly rustling in the leaves. The frozen nuts that they were cracking rattled. My every nerve was tense in anticipation of some action. The wind began to pick up, and I glanced behind me just in time to see 200 yards away a buck crossing the field out of his bed. Still I remained sitting and hoping that something would visit my plot, or that they would see my doe and be drawn in. And then, as if out of nowhere, behind me, along the fence row, came a doe and her fawn who had recently lost his spots, which put me in a moral dilemma. However, they were not on my side of the property line as they moved behind my stand, but I was ready in case they did. Sitting, watching, rapt with attention, As the doe and fawn worked their way behind my stand, I questioned myself. Would I shoot a doe off of a fawn? He didn't have his spots anymore. However, it was a decision that I did not have to make, because as the sun rose higher, they simply had vanished. And so finally, my hunt came to an end. It was an absolutely perfect morning, despite the fact that I had killed no deer. Sometimes it's about absorbing the experience. And I also took heart in knowing that they were moving in the daylight now, and the randomness of the deer might just bring them under my stand.
Awesome morning. Still got a hoarfrost on the ground. Walking out with a deer over my shoulder, but ain't much meat on this one. Wicked cold this morning. Had a little bit of deer activity, but somehow they can just vanish. If you're wondering why I'm carrying this decoy like this, it's because I'm Tex Grebner of Tex Grebner Outdoors, and I lost the bungee strap that holds it all together. So I'm carrying it out like this. So stay tuned. Thanks for coming out hunting with me.
It was an unseasonably warm afternoon, considering that it had actually frosted in the morning again. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. Different sights, different sounds, even different smells. The same primitive emotions, but always a brand new adventure. The sun was just beginning to sink, and I knew, either by prior experience or purely instinct, that something was going to happen tonight. The wind was blowing in my face, and it was the type of evening that all Midwestern whitetail hunters dream about. Sitting, watching, waiting, and listening. My decoy out in my food plot coated with Evercalm sitting along the fence line. I was ready in my ambush. Everything was just so perfect. And yet as the sun began to sink, the temperatures rapidly dropped, and with the quickening in the air, I knew something, not just what, but something was going to happen. And as I sat, watching, waiting, listening, observing and absorbing the natural world, I questioned in my head, was I right not to take the buck on opening day? However, as I still sat, having an internal conversation, I realized that I would rather question whether or not it was right to not shoot at all and go home empty-handed versus having the guilt of taking a shot that I would regret. And so still I sat, and still the sun sank lower and lower. At this point, I was praying to any god or gods that would listen that I would have the fortitude to endure the cold. The wind still in my face. Everything was absolutely perfect, even though I shivered as I tried my best to sit still. But I knew something had to happen. And then, as if from nowhere, I saw a young deer out in the beans behind my stand. Not exactly what I was looking for, but I gave a bleat on my call, and it came trotting in to examine my decoy. I watched and waited. Now, if that deer came in over the fence or under the fence, I would take it as an opportunistic predator. Unbeknownst to me, in my excitement standing up, I had activated my emergency beacon light. And still, this young deer came into the decoy. I watched in open-mouthed amazement that I was not spooking this deer. My wind was blowing directly to this young deer. And then, as I still watched, I questioned myself, would I take this deer? A doe had approached across the field completely without my notice, and I was able to witness something truly beautiful. In the wild, savage world, there are some sights that only human hunters get to appreciate. This fawn had lost its spots, but was still nursing. And so at this point, I made the decision that I was no longer hunting, that I was going to be wildlife photographing. Minutes dragged on as the sun sank lower, and I had gone from shivering to having a completely warmed heart. The doe could smell something was not quite right, but with the evercomb on the decoy, she was confused. She could smell deer, she just couldn't see deer. And yet still through all of this melodrama, my beacon light was still flashing, filming the doe as she searched for the deer that she had heard bleat. She finally came around to inspect my decoy. Now she was on the other side of the property line, and morally I would not take the shot, while it was perfect. Ethically, I would not shoot a doe that still had a fawn nursing. And so open-mouthed as my wind blew right to this doe, I watched and filmed. And then she looked directly at me, not quite sure what was going on, because the doe under my stand, my decoy, was not at all spooked. Until she saw the motion light blinking away in my pants, at which point she lifted her tail and took her fawn back across the field. Shivering now, but yet completely satisfied and surprised that even though she had clearly spotted me, she had not blown or stomped. She had just simply taken off. Many people cannot understand how we can love these majestic animals so much and yet strive to kill them. And I say that hunting itself is an act of worship.
My God, what a perfect night. You know, just when you think you're about froze stiff, all of a sudden you get to see something that just not only warms your heart, but man, you go from shivering to just rock solid. But one, they weren't on my side of the property line, and because he's still nursing, it didn't really matter, because we may be an apex predator, but unlike other animals, we have a concept of the finiteness of our resources. So he's lost his spots, but he's still nursing, which means if I took that doe, I'd be killing 2 deer with 1 tag. We may be an apex predator, but we're also stewards of the natural world. Now, if they come back and he's weaned off, then it's a different story. But man, that was something to see.
Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. It was a perfect evening for deer hunting. The type of evening that all Midwestern whitetail hunters dream about. After all, to be honest with you, there are many evenings and many mornings outside of deer season that we simply dream of deer hunting. The deer moved earlier than usual. I watched them through my binoculars moving across the hillside on the opposite side of the bean field. And so I sat, watching my food plot, waiting, listening, observing and absorbing. But when the deers moved across the field, I began to get slightly excited. There were 3 of them, a doe and 2 yearlings. But my mind was at ease because her 2 yearlings were feeding on the beans rather than chasing her for milk. They moved across the field, slowly feeding, free and wild and uncontrollable. They were moving toward the creek that circled around through my property. Occasionally, as I watched them, I would also turn my head to watch my food plot in case anything came cruising through. But they moved, free and easy, in their majestic, wild way that whitetail and all beautiful creatures move in, and I watched them move toward the creek to drink and bed. Sitting, yet again, hoping they would swing up the creek and around to my plot, I listened to the birds and watched a rabbit in the briar patch beneath my stand. Were rabbits in season at this point, I would have been walking out with game because it was an easy shot. And yet, the sun sank lower and lower, and my spirits rose higher and higher. I could hardly wait for the return of the deer. Even though they were far out of range and off of the property that I had permission to hunt on, there is something to be said for wildlife photography and enjoying nature as both a predator and an observer. And so I casually watched these deer, yet again, feed back across the field to a different bed, wild and free. There is no predicting a wild animal. And so majestically they moved, and still another deer came out of the creek. There were now 4 deer, 2 does, and a spike buck, all feeding out in the soybeans that had been picked. I hoped upon hope that as the sun sank lower and lower, that I would have the fortitude to stay until dark. As the sun sank, so did the mercury yet again, and the deer fed across the field behind me, and I still watched my plot, in case a buck would make himself apparent. The hooting of an owl stirred the rabbit nervously in the briar patch beneath my stand, as I watched, waiting, and listening to the symphony of geese flying south over my head. Everything was absolutely perfect. The type of evening that all Midwestern whitetail hunters dream about. But as the night wrapped the timber in her dark embrace, I realized that while perfect, my hunt had come to an end. And yet, again, I did not feel cheated, for I had hunted.
It was just about a perfect night. But it begs the question, is it more frustrating to see no deer at all, or to see a whole bunch of deer that you don't really have access to?
It had been a very stormy morning, and it had kept me out of the timber, and so I was very happy when the weather broke. I set up my decoy, got into my stand, and prepared myself in case tonight would be a moment of truth. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different and a brand new adventure. Sitting, watching, waiting, and listening, I watched the blue jays in the treetops fighting and listened to their chattering and their cries of thief, thief, thief. Now, you see, all animals speak the same language, they just speak in different dialects, which means that bird alarm calls can totally ruin your hunt. Because if a blue jay spots you, he will fly through the timber crying, man, man, man. Occasionally, I would check the field, even though I could not shoot into it. And then, as the sun sank a little bit lower and the temperature dropped, a doe made herself apparent, calmly feeding on the spilled soybeans that had begun to sprout. She fed like this, unconcernedly, for hours. Occasionally, I would turn my head back to watch her, but mostly, as she was not of my concern, I did watch my food plot, hoping and praying that I would have the fortitude to remain in my stand until dark, as the temperature was rapidly dropping and there was a cold mist in the air. The rain returned with a vengeance, and still I sat, watching, waiting, hoping, praying to any gods that would listen. I had been forced to trade out my archery glove for my winter gloves, or my early autumn gloves, more accurately. The rain let up for a bit, and still I sat, still as I could, listening to the rain falling on the forest floor, and every shaking branch made me think that it was the antlers of a buck knocking the water droplets off and coming in to inspect my decoy. But yet it is amazing what your mind will create when you are sitting in a tree stand. It was a beautiful evening despite the rain, despite the cold. This is what we as deer hunters live for. Still I sat. Still the misty downpour continued. And I thought to myself, as the night drew nearer and nearer, if something was going to happen, it had better happen soon. Because I did not relish the prospect of having a moment of truth and yet not being able to recover my quarry because the rain had washed away the blood trail. The temperature dropped even further, and the rain had let up yet again. Sitting, watching, waiting, the shadows lengthening, night beginning to wrap its dark embrace around the timber, causing my heart to race, despite the frigid temperatures, until finally I decided I could not shoot in this light. I could not recover an animal without fear of losing the blood trail. And so my hunt this evening had came to an end, but yet I had hunted.
Well, what can I say? Deer are wild and free, majestic creatures.
Everything was still and black and frosted when I arrived at the woods that morning. And as the sun rose, The frosted blackness merged into a gray, misty rain. Sitting, watching, waiting, listening, hoping that the rise in temperature would force the deer to begin moving toward the field. Sitting as still as I could, watching my decoy sway in the breeze that was luckily in my face. I had found a rub the other day when I was walking in, and I hoped that a buck would come to investigate. But as I sat listening to the rain drumming incessantly on my hat brim, watching the squirrels scampering and collecting nuts for the winter and storing them in their dens, watching the rabbit cower down in the briar bush, and hearing the scream of a hawk flying through the rain, I confronted dilemmas within my own mind. Why was I out here? Honestly, I questioned it. If a deer came beneath me, I also had another dilemma. Could I follow a blood trail before it was washed away? Hunting with a recurve in the rain is difficult because feathers are not waterproof, and so I would have to quickly get my arrow on the string and get off a shot. Peering through the drizzling gray mist, watching the creek swell in its banks, I realized that I was gifted a beautiful opportunity. You see, I know what the sound of rain and peaceful leaves sound like, the same way that I know what the sound of frost melting is. I have experienced and drank in the harsh cruelty of the natural world, and so still I sat, as still as I could, dripping wet on the outside and warm under my insulation, until finally I made the decision that even if a deer did show up, I could not ethically take a shot, simply because I would not be able to recover my animal if it did not drop in plain sight. And so as the rain continued, I left the timber. But sometimes you simply have to take a chance. You cannot hunt unless you are actually hunting. Imagine my surprise as with one boot on my tree step, my bow in my hand, and hanging precariously off the ground after setting up my decoys and setting up my camera, that I was not alone. This doe looked from the decoy and looked at me. And I believe the only reason that she did not run off right then and there was that she was too busy laughing at the sight of me hanging off my tree step and trying to film her. She was on the other side of the fence, and so she was not really in any danger. And the evercomb that I had put on the fence post and that was blowing from my decoy to her probably didn't hurt matters any. But eventually, she did finally realize that she needed to leave and made her way across the field. I made it up into my tree stand without further difficulties, and I was just amazed that the deer had moved this early in the day. Either that or I had spooked her out of her bed. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is a brand new adventure. I had tried some rattling since the sun was still fairly high, and I had found a scrape. My heart almost jumped from my chest, however, when I heard the leaves rustle as soon as I had put my rattles up. It proved only to be a pair of squirrels playing amongst the fence wires. Still I sat, watching, waiting, listening, enjoying the uncertainty and the adventure. The sun sank lower and lower, and I hoped that something would come to investigate my decoys. The food plot was green from all the rain in October, and everything was absolutely perfect. And yet the afternoon merged into evening, and the sun began to sink lower and lower minute by minute. The wind was perfect in my face. The only trouble was, the only time that I had seen deer except for opening day was behind me. And then I noticed something out the corner of my eye. Deer had moved from their beds and were beginning to feed out into the field, as if on cue. I thought to myself, oh, please God, let them come this way. There was a big doe, 2 yearlings, and I could see off in the trees a spikebuck sitting, watching them, attempting to film, and enjoying their presence. They fed unconcernedly, completely oblivious to me, but I had my bow at the ready in case a buck should enter my food plot to challenge my decoy. The sun continued to sink, and the hunting call of an owl sounded the end to my hunt for November 1st. The shooting light was almost all gone, and the filming light was far gone. I had sat, and I had been an active participant in nature.
First day in November, All Saints Day, year of our Lord 2015, come to a close. At least I know where they bed, but deer are wild and free, beautiful, majestic creatures, and they're uncontrollable. It's always a brand new adventure, and it's a brand new month. I'm getting a little bit frustrated, getting a little bit nervous, but I'm also getting excited because the stakes are getting higher. So stay tuned. Welcome to November.
The stakes were even higher now. It was November. 1 full month of deer season had elapsed. The rut was approaching, and it was an unseasonably warm evening. I made my way as quickly and as quietly as I could across the crunching leaves. It was later than I wanted to get to my tree stand, but I had the opportunity to hunt, and so I took it. Watching my food plot, waiting, sitting as still as I could, and listening. I watched as a blue heron speared minnows within the creek. I waited, and the crunching of leaves under squirrel foot would send my heart into my throat. It was the type of November evening that all Midwestern whitetail hunters dream about, wondering when the rut would kick off. As the sun sank, and so did the temperature, remained relatively warm. The shooting light began to rapidly fade, and I stared into my food plot, envisioning a buck walking beneath my scrape. When I opened my eyes, there was nothing. I checked the field behind me. Still nothing. Normally they would have arrived by now. And still, in the creek, the heron continued with his hunt. Sitting as still as I could as the shooting light continued to fade, it was still the perfect evening. Everything was absolutely perfect. And while I did not have much shooting light left, I was determined to stay until dark, simply to observe and absorb the natural world.
So I've got to feel that you guys are going to watch me slowly descend into madness. Is it possible that even without a kill, that you could have a perfect hunt? I think the answer is yes. There's a delicious uncertainty in what we do. And white-tailed deer are free, majestic, and above all, wild creatures. There's a reason why, when we lived off the land, that we worshipped things that we could not control.
Totally unknown to me at the time, my stand had had a visitor, a very important visitor, a very frustrating visitor just before I arrived. The new fallen leaves had been wet by midday showers, and so my approach to my tree stand was almost silent. It was the type of November evening that all Midwestern whitetail hunters dream about. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. I sat eating dinner on my evening hunt. The slightest crack of a twig would simply send my heart into my throat. Sitting, watching, waiting, listening, enjoying the pleasant weather and waiting for some action, staring, visualizing, listening. The wind was in my face. I had my decoy out, and everything was absolutely perfect. But deer, as I have said, are wild and free, majestic creatures. And there is no controlling them. There is no predicting them. Sitting, listening to the raccoons next to my stand, I watched the heron in the creek spearfishing minnows once again, until finally I turned my head, and here they were in the field right behind me. The doe and her yearling, now eating grain. However, they fed in the field until dark, and my hunt came to a close as the lady of the night wrapped the timber in her dark embrace. It was a perfect night, the type of hunt that we all dream about. It was a chilly morning for a change. The November weather was finally getting back to normal. I sat, watching, waiting, listening. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. And as I sat, watching my decoy sway in the breeze, everything else was so still. It was as if the squirrels had slept in. High above my head, a bald eagle soared, and I was able to witness it in the wild. Watching the fence row, watching my food plot, and watching the sun rise and the temperature stay remarkably the same as I remained in the shade. Everything was so perfect, the type of morning that all Midwestern whitetail hunters dream about, because after all, we dream about it the entire rest of the year. Sitting in my stand as the sun climbed higher and higher, feeling the pressure, the overwhelming pressure of the crunch of time. Shotgun season was rapidly approaching, and the whitetails in the Midwest, when the gun seasons begin, simply go crazy. They become incredibly skittish. And so if you haven't got your buck before the shotgun season begins, you will have an even harder time of it. As I sat, I reflected upon what a sportsman is. A sportsman is an athlete engaged in outdoor pursuits who meets all challenges with an equal degree of grace in both victory and defeat, and conducts themselves in a sportsman-like manner. This is quintessential to the actual ethic of fair chase deer hunting. And so as my hunt came to a close, I did not feel cheated.
Things that'll piss you off. That track was not there when I walked in this morning. And the slow descent into madness continues. Finally starting to have some November weather. Absolutely beautiful morning in the woods.
The evening hunt commenced, and I was using a totally different tactic. I had set my decoy in the open, and I had moved into the open behind a clump of brush in hopes that a buck cruising the fence line would enter the pasture to inspect the doe and would pass me broadside at a fairly close range and be distracted. It was quite chilly and I was underdressed, but I had done so on purpose to avoid sweating and revealing my scent since I was on the ground, sitting, watching, waiting, listening, the dark beginning to come down hard upon the timber. I reflected, it is not really a mystery that when you are actually actively pursuing a force beyond your control, that you would do things to please it, to try and draw it nearer to you, to try and exert some influence over it. And as the dark came down even harder, I realized, aha, that is why the ancient cultures worshipped their game animals as gods in an attempt to exert some control.
Came out, sat, tried something new. No luck. Gonna try and make it out in the morning. Shotgun season's coming up quick when these woods are gonna turn into a blaze orange battleground. So the stakes are getting higher with every passing hour. And yeah, I'm nervous. But there's no great success without great suffering.
And so, on a brand new day, my quest continued. I made it to my stand just as the sun was rising orange above the timber. Everything was absolutely perfect. It was a frosty morning, and the sun rose gold above the treetops. The wind was in my face, blowing slightly across me as well. Everything was so absolutely wonderful, and excitement filled me as the sun rose. I sat, watching, waiting, listening, eating the last of the deer salami from a previous deer years ago. The frost of my breath obscured my vision as the sun glare hit it as I peered beneath the underbrush, watching, waiting, hoping, praying, thankful to God that I had actually dressed for the weather today. My doe decoy was in my food plot, coated with estrus scent, in hopes that a buck would come cruising behind me or in front of me. The crows were very active this morning, cawing their heart's content as they fought over the spilled soybeans in the field behind me. The sun climbed a little bit higher, and occasionally I would use my doe bleat call in hopes that a buck would be lured out of the timber. Slowly but surely the sun climbed even higher, and I remained in my stand into the mid-morning, in hopes and dreams, sitting, watching, and praying. And then, like a ghost, slipping through the timber beside me, there was a doe, simply skirting my food plot. She walked calmly down to the creek to drink, too far away to film, too far away to shoot, and so I simply watched her. She went to the creek, she drank, and she crossed the creek to a bedding area. And still I sat, watching her exit the bedding area and walk stealthily down the creek. I had my bow on my knees, ready in case she would come to the food plot, prepared for an impending moment of truth. Everything was so absolutely perfect. But she passed back out of the property just out of range of my bow, and so I let her walk. Deer are wild and free, unpredictable, majestic creatures, and that is truly the appeal of hunting them. For you see, even as my hunt came to a close, my heart was full, because I had watched a deer, being a deer, completely unaffected by hunting pressure, and I had learned for the future where I may want to put a tree stand.
That's about it for today. I'm not going to be able to come out hunting this evening. Stakes are getting higher, but at least I'm starting to see them move in the daylight. So stay tuned.
As much as I love the excitement of hunting the sunrise, today I'd gotten in the stand at 11, and I was in for a very long day of hunting. But every day of hunting is exactly the same, and every day of hunting is just a little bit different. I had set out my doe and my buck decoy in my food plot. The wind was in my face and absolutely perfect. The afternoon continued, seeming to drag by until the magic hours would arrive. Sitting, watching, waiting, listening, and reflecting, observing and absorbing, as my food plot remained empty. It was fairly warm in the early afternoon, but as the sun sank, so did the temperature, and I had a good feeling. I couldn't explain it, but there was that quickening in the air, that strange energy. It was again a day that all Midwestern whitetail hunters dream about. Because how many of us have gone to bed at night and lain awake, unable to sleep before a morning hunt? Because in the darkness of our bedroom, our mind is creating a phantasmagoria of deer swirling above our head. And then, as the sun finally began to sink quicker and quicker, I looked at the ridge across the bean field behind my stand. My food plot remained empty, and yet, on the ridge behind my stand, there were 3 does, all feeding on the acorns. And then, all hell broke loose beside me. There was a tree that was shaking like mad, and I could hear branches crackling against each other. I had my bow in readiness. All the hours before this were wiped away in the excitement and anticipation. I hit my can call in hopes that a buck would come charging into my estrus doe, and the sound of my call startled a squirrel in the branches that he was shaking. Disappointed, but still flushed with the energy of the impending encounter that my mind had created, I sat as the sun sank and the does continued to feed on acorns on the ridge. You never know what will happen. The sun sank lower and lower, and the owls took to wing and began their hunt for the night as my hunt came to a close.
Perfect early November deer hunting weather. Perfect early November deer hunt. Deer moving in the daylight. Everything's wonderful. It just didn't line up the way I wanted it to. But you know, I don't have a say in what these critters are doing. I just gotta hunt hard and be there. So the slow descent into madness continues. Stay tuned. You ain't gonna want to miss it.
I had lain awake far too long in the middle of the night, oppressed by visions of deer, and so it was a mid-morning hunt as I had overslept the sunrise. Every single leaf that fell, rattling its way down through the bare branches, would send my nerves on edge. My decoys were in my food plot, swaying tremendously with the vicious wind. Since it was a mid-morning hunt, I decided if all else fails, maybe I could rattle a buck out of his bed to come challenge my Montana decoy. But as there was no activity and I had missed the sunrise, I decided that I was going to cut the limbs off of a pine tree that was in my way and build a ground blind. I returned for an evening hunt. The weather was starting to turn bad as I sat nervously in the creek bed, watching, waiting, listening. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. And then, like ghosts floating through the timber silently, came the deer, all around me as I sat nervously praying to myself and swallowing my tobacco juice. 3 does had entered the pasture and were down at the creek drinking. The wind was in my face, and I hoped upon hope as I sat, continuing to swallow my tobacco spit and pray that they would come in front of my ground blind that I had built to inspect my decoys. But eventually, they moved on about their business, and I still sat, watching, waiting, listening, hot and flushed with the excitement of the encounter. Everything was so absolutely perfect. I had seen deer, deer had evaded me, and the dance of predator and prey continues. Still I sat. As the sun sank lower and lower, the wind picked up and the temperature dropped, waiting until the last of the shooting light, waiting in case a buck would come in, never knowing. But as the sun sank lowest and the dark lady of the night wrapped the timber in her final embrace, I realized I could not shoot, nor film, nor recover a deer in this light. But amazingly, I had seen deer, and I was happy.
It has been a frustratingly awesome day.
I never sleep well before a morning hunt, and so as I walked into the timber dragging my rut line, I was tired and ragged and cold, as frost from my breath formed in my mustache. But it was the perfect November morning. The rut was in full swing, and everything was so beautifully still. I had drugged my rut line around the property, and I had positioned my decoy so that if a buck did arrive, he would follow my rut line directly to my decoy and present me with a 10-yard shot at broadside. But as I sat watching, waiting, and listening, my hands buried in the muff to keep them stable and warm, I questioned myself, if a buck did arrive, would I be able to haul back all 90 pounds of my bow? Would I be able to rise to the moment of truth? And as I sat, feeling the same primal emotions that our ancestors felt, I realized if it was the moment of truth when life and death hang in the balance, I would get my bow back and take aim on sheer willpower alone. But the sun rose and the frost melted, and I had seen no activity except for hawks scooping squirrels off of branches. I used my can call a few times in hopes of luring a buck that might be cruising the edge of the bean field. My hopes were sloping downward, but every day of hunting is exactly the same, and every day of hunting is just a little bit different. Every day of hunting is a brand new adventure with different sights and different sounds. And so still I sat, still chilled, but absorbing and observing the natural world. Of course, as luck would have it, unbeknownst to me, there was a buck cruising up my rut line just as I was answering the call of nature.
Well, I blew it. Stood up to piss. 50 yards away, coming up my scent drag, is an 8-point that looks like he'd score Pope and Young. I blew it. The madness continues.
It was mid-morning when I got into my stand. It was a warm morning. It was calm, and everything was so wonderful. And as I sat, the hours dragging past, I reflected on the words of Hemingway as the shotgun season drew nearer and nearer as the day slowly moved on. Now, it is pleasant to hunt something that you want very, very much over a long period of time. Being outwitted, outmaneuvered, and failing at the end of each day, but having the hunt and knowing that each time that you are out, sooner or later, your luck will change and you will get the chance that you have been seeking. But it is not pleasant to have a time limit by which you must get your kudu, perhaps never get it, nor even see one. It is not the way that hunting should be. The way to hunt is as long as you live against as long as there is such and such an animal. Just as the way to paint is as long as there is you and colors and canvas, and the way to write is as long as you can live and as long as there is ink, paper, pencil, or any machine to do it with, or anything you care to write about, and you feel a fool and you are a fool to do it any other way. The sun had slowly moved from one side of the sky to the other, and now was slowly sinking beyond the trees. The temperature was also sinking, and I had been reduced to using the muff again. Many of you may ask, why do I hunt the same stands every day? And the fact is, it is what I have. It is where I hunt. It is what I have access to. I do not have a huge lease. I do not have an outfitter. I have agricultural whitetail access, and that is what I have. And as I sat, reflecting upon Hemingway's words, I was determined that I would hunt for as long as I could, in hopes that my luck would change. Because every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. The entire day, deer had been moving all around me, except where I wanted them to be. And every quivering branch, every tread of the squirrels upon the leaves would send my heart into my throat with excitement. The magic hour was upon me, and the shooting light was rapidly fading, and I knew that if something was going to happen, it had better happen soon. Still I sat, watching my decoys swaying in the breeze that was in my face. Everything was so absolutely perfect as the dark lady of the night finally wrapped her dark embrace around the trees. The owls took wing, and my hunt came to an end.
And so, the madness continues. Shotgun season's getting closer, the stakes are getting higher, and the rut's on.
A cold, drizzling rain had been going on all day. It was the type of evening that all Midwestern whitetail hunters dream about in November, when the bucks are chasing does across the field. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. I had gotten into my blind and proceeded to sit for hour upon hour as the sun behind the clouds slowly sank. I had set up my decoy in the creek bed, and everything was so absolutely perfect as I watched the geese fly southward. I knew that if something was going to happen as twilight drew nearer and nearer, that it would have to happen soon. But there is no forcing nature. These are wild and free, majestic creatures, and you cannot control them. And so, as I sat in the blind, watching, waiting, listening, the sun finally sank below the trees, and night rapidly enveloped the creek bed.
Beautiful, cold, rainy night. Coming out empty-handed again.
I was soaked from the waist down as I made it into my tree stand in the early afternoon. The past days of unending rain had completely swelled the creek well above my boots. Sitting, watching, waiting, shivering in the savage wind, I had little hope for this hunt, but big dreams, because every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. My decoys swayed back and forth in the savage wind down in my food plot. The creek had swelled in its banks so badly that I had little hope of a buck crossing it from the front, so any action that would happen would come from behind, which was not heartening as the wind was in my face. The squirrels ran on the soaked leaves, and the wind continued. I sat as still as I could, despite the shivering, questioning, wondering, was I cursed? But as the sun sank lower and lower, slowly but surely the temperature dropped even more. And I made up my mind and steeled my resolve that I would finish this hunt, come hell or the high water. The sun sank lower and lower, and night began to draw nearer and nearer. I watched the field edges in hopes that a buck would come cruising and spot my decoys from behind. But still they swayed in the savage wind. Finally, the wind near dark had begun to calm down, The gun seasons were rapidly approaching, and the stakes were getting higher and higher. Finally, my prayers were answered, but not in a way that I wanted them to be. A buck was chasing a doe across the bean field. Not of my concern, as I could not shoot into the bean field. But the sun finally sank away, and the night came on, and my hunt came to an end. But as I left, I knew I had hunted.
Cold, wet, frustrated, empty-handed. The descent into madness continues. But you know what? Screw it. I'm still hunting. I'm not giving up. Most of you probably don't care, but this is the way it goes.
The creek still raged in front of me, and time was running out. I sat, watching, waiting, listening. The trees shook with the tremendous wind. My decoys were set in my food plot, and I had applied some buck lure. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. And as the morning had gone on, it became an emotional battle to remain in the swaying tree. Suffering and wondering. All it takes is one crack of a twig to take hours and hours of sulking and waiting and turn it into complete excitement. But my food plot remained empty. The creek blocked deer passage from the front of my stand, and the wind was blowing tremendously in my face, spreading my scent throughout the field. I was stiff and chilled and tired, but as the sun rose overhead and the wind calmed down for a bit, I stood to reduce my shadow in hopes that a buck would come to check out my decoys. But deer are wild and free, majestic creatures, and we have no control over them, and such is the allure of hunting. The weather was so poor and so chilly that even the squirrels had abandoned nuts and had stayed in their trees. But as the hunt of the morning wound down, I knew that I had hunted, and I had done my best.
So I'm pretty much trespassing, because be damned if I'm gonna go crotch deep in the creek just to walk out. So Mr. Landowner, I'm sorry. I'm frustrated, but I don't feel cheated. Because honestly, the reason that we take such joy in hunting is because it has very high highs and very low lows. And hours of sullen boredom can change to excitement with nothing more than a casual snap of a twig. If you bothered to watch this far, thanks for watching.
As you might have guessed by this point in my season, deer hunting in Illinois is not the glorified Pike County pornography that you all see on outdoor programming. I bring you the reality of a deer season. Sitting, watching, waiting, listening. Quite honestly, I didn't even want to go out. I can't bring the amount of frustration and desperation that I was feeling to you. You see, I had quit my day job. As the Australians say, I had completely gone walkabout. I had quit my day job to chase a dream. The dream is to produce my own well-respected outdoor show. I was set up along the south side of the creek. There was a thorn tree thicket and a ridge in front of me. I had my decoys set to pull anything across the fence that might see them as they made their way up to the opposite bean field. Sitting, watching, waiting, listening, the wind still savagely shaking the trees, but at least it was in my face. I kept hearing what sounded like antlers rubbing on a tree trunk, but I simply chalked it up in my frustration to a squirrel enlarging the hole upon a hollow tree. The wind was in my face, and I had never anticipated a buck actually crossing the torrent of the creek behind me. But there he was, snorting and prancing as my sudden movement spooked him. It had in fact been his antlers rubbing on a tree.
Yeah, that right there's fresh.
It was fresh. I hadn't got a good look at his points, but as the dark came on, I shook my head in frustration and wonder and amazement at the animal that I pursued. I packed up my gear and made my way up to the hill. I was using an antelope trick now, as I had made my way up the hill and spotted a doe making her way to the beans. She was on the opposite side of the fence, however, by the time I got my bow into position, but she had not spooked because of my decoy.
Well, shoot. That almost worked. If it would have been a buck, I bet it would have worked. But I'm still legal. You know, that kind of makes it all worthwhile. Sundown. Last hunt before shotgun season. I'm frustrated, but I don't feel cheated. It's going to get a lot colder, and it's going to get even harder from here. But I refuse to give up.
The woods were finally calm again. The gun season was over, and I knew that deer would be keeping to the open, where they could not be reached by gunfire or archery. I did not have to wait very long before my first deer sighting. I could see 3 does bedded in the angle of the fence, and so I watched them, waiting and listening. The wind was in my face, and everything was absolutely perfect. It was a type of November evening that all Midwestern whitetail hunters dream about. The rut was on. There were deer living after the shotgun season, and everything was just so absolutely perfect, except for the fact that the deer were on somebody else's property. My decoys were set up, and the sun was sinking. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. And I sat praying to God that they would come in to investigate my decoys. The temperature was falling with the sun, and the deer became even more active as they began to leave their beds. These 3 does fed out into the bean field across the fence, until they were joined by still another 3 does. 6 does began feeding 200 yards away from me. And so, with the wind still in my face, I continued to watch them, unharassed and completely calm. The snow crunched under their hooves, and the wind was calm enough that occasionally I could hear them. They spooked, and I couldn't figure out why, until, like a rocket across the field, came a buck. At 300 yards, I could see his antlers. He was an absolute monster. He paused for a moment and then took off. I knew it couldn't have been me, but he had caught the scent of a doe. One of the does must have been hot, because he cut a circle like a hound where she had been standing, and far out of range as I watched the mystical creature, he took off on the trail of the hot doe. But everything was so perfect as the sun continued to sink, and still more does and a fork-horn buck entered the field. I was able to watch them, and still I watched them as the sun finally reached the horizon and my hunt came to an end. I was chilled to the bone, but I was filled with excitement. A buck had survived, and he was massive.
Slow descent into madness continues. A lot of deer activity tonight. Good to see that a buck survived the shotgun season. But he didn't get that big by getting shot at. Changed up a little bit, went to a new stand. But he was on some hot does, so I couldn't stop him or get him to even look. He cut that circle like a hound dog and he was off. But I'm still hunting, so stay tuned.
Admittedly, I was beginning to get a bit desperate, and so I wanted to maximize my options. I had decided to scout a new location, a small patch of timber in a cattle pasture. I snuck up behind my decoy. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. It's almost impossible when you are sneaking in this manner not to feel primal emotion stirred within you, as if you were a Native American in a coyote suit sneaking up on a herd of buffalo. This tactic was, however, very effective, so effective that I had almost walked on top of a young doe before I even noticed her, or she took notice of me.
You know, you always see the glory, and you always see the finished product. But very rarely in outdoor television do you see the long nights spent scheming, plotting, hoping, and praying. Well, guess what? I'm Tex Grebner of Tex Grebner Outdoors, and I deal in reality. So this deer season, you're getting it all. I'd say that is some pretty decent sign. Limbing out one of these here pine trees to hang a stand on. Now this is just about a postage stamp of timber with a hayfield at the back and a cattle pasture at the front and a bunch of pine trees. Now I've honestly never really bothered to put a stand up here because I couldn't imagine why anything would come, 1,000 yards away from any other cover. But with the hayfield out the back and this cattail pond down here where I hunt my frogs at, I suppose better late than never. I'm actually going to be putting in a stand here pretty shortly. But there's rubs everywhere that are just absolutely fresh. And I ended up bumping a young doe out of here this morning when I came in to scout it out. So I'm still hunting hard. Normally I would just order something, but they're all out of stock with it being deer season and all. So I pretty much had to fab up an extra camera mount. This is a double hanger. I cut the hanger off one end of it, took it apart, drilled it out for 1/2-inch bolt heads, and took a trail camera screw-in mount, drilled that out and mounted it. So now I have a homemade camera mount, pretty much like what I started filming on years ago. What I have here is a Black Hawk tree stand sniper stand that I just put together. And I'm going to be hanging this bad boy tomorrow in the tree that I showed you. Well, it was a beautiful Thanksgiving, Black Friday. It's 34 degrees and drizzling rain and blowing its guts out. But I just finished up hanging my camera arm here. Got a nice little bow hanger limb here for my recurve. As you can see here, I'm using a lumberjack style safety harness strap from the ratchet that I didn't need to use. Got my stand hung. Raided Walmart for ratchets last night. And I strapped the old sections of my tree stands together to use the ladders. And so, miserable day, but I'm gonna get out of here, maybe try an evening hunt at one of my other stands, but at least I've got this up so that I've got options. Like I say, you guys don't see the long nights of hoping, praying, and scheming. You just don't see it. You don't see the worry, you don't see the suffering. Tex Grebner here with Tex Grebner Outdoors. I bring you the reality of a deer season. Pretty good view. So the creek is way high, so I pretty much had to be a reluctant trespasser to get in here. I've got my decoys set up. I don't want to say that I'm hopeful, but sometimes luck just happens.
It was the type of late November evening that all Midwestern whitetail hunters dream about. I was using a double doe decoy set, estrus on both. My food plot was still green, the frost had not killed it. Everything was so absolutely perfect. The hours dragged past as I waited for the sunset. I knew that there would be action. I had watched these deer enough, and I hoped that the laws of randomness would bring one beneath my stand where I could take a shot. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. And so I looked over my shoulder, and there they were, two does feeding their way across the bean field. They would occasionally look up and inspect my decoys, and then rapidly they would lose interest and go back to feeding. Sitting, watching, waiting, hoping, and praying. Primal emotions were stirred in me, but yet it was terribly cold. I had gone in dressed far too light for the weather, and I sat shivering despite my flushed red face. Occasionally I would look down and be startled by the breeze swaying my decoy, and I would wonder, how did a deer get there without me even knowing it? And then realize it was my decoy. The does moved on up the ridge behind me, and a buck entered the bean field. I tried to get his attention with my can call. He was about 150 yards away, but I could see his antlers clear as day. He was a massive buck. I wasn't sure if it was the same buck that I had seen before. But if I can see his antlers without a spotting scope, then he is the king of the forest, in my opinion. And he had survived the shotgun season. Now the wind was blowing on the back of my neck, and so I was safe from being detected by scent, even though in preparation for this hunt I had coated my jacket and pants with Evercalm just to hedge my bets. It was so cold that after filming the buck, my hands were so numb that I dropped the arrow off my string and it fell like a javelin to the dirt. And yet my food plot remained empty. The buck in the cold was more intent on food than on does at this point. The dark began to come on, and the buck did not come into my food plot. He fed up the ridge as well, to browse upon the soft buds that had come out with the warmth of Thanksgiving. Still the chill oppressed me, but I was fulfilled in that I had hunted, and the slow descent into madness continued. I occasionally would check the field to see if anything else would come out, but my hunt rapidly came to a close as the woods became too dark to shoot. I did, however, meet the landlord on my way out and was able to secure permission to shoot into the field.
This could be a really good night of deer hunting, or it could be another bust. But the good news is, like I said last night, I just talked to the landowner of this bean field, and I just acquired hunting permission on an awful lot more land. So I don't know how much of it I'm going to be able to hunt this year, but I do know I just gained a whole bunch of options. The only trouble is he's cleaning up his barnyard with a bobcat back there, so the deer might be spooked as hell right now. So I'm not really sure. But I do have a 12-ounce bottle worth of estrus, and I'm going to do a rut drag around the bean field and see if I can't pull one in. But the awesome news is I got hunting permission, so things may start looking up, but even if they don't, that's the way hunting goes. And there'll always be next year if I live that long. So I got my bow with me. Just in case I kick something up. I have pretty much now done a figure 8 with this rut line all the way around the bean field. So here's hoping. Coated down with Evercalm. So I should at least stink like a deer. Now that I've actually got access to show you guys this, they bed in there. So I just drug a road stripe to Lovetown. I have 2 Montana doe decoys coated in Evercalm and coated in VS.
Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. It was the type of November evening that all Midwestern whitetail hunters dream about. Everything was so absolutely perfect. I had drug my rut line around the field, set up my decoys, and I was feeling primal emotions. I had seen the buck the night before, and I had so much riding on the hunt, so much pressure, so much angst, so much tension. Occasionally the squirrel would run through the leaves, but by and large the woods were calm. The wind was blowing on my back, but I was coated down with Evercalm to hedge my bets. The drone of the bobcat was off in the distance as the afternoon continued. I was afraid that it had spooked the deer from coming into the field, or perhaps as the evening went on and my food plot and the field remained empty, they had moved to a different field in their pattern of rotation. As the sun sank lower and lower, it got colder and colder, but I had not made the same mistake twice, and I was bundled up quite warmly so that I was almost sweating as the wind cooled the back of my neck. I was so very happy that I had acquired land permission so that if a deer came behind me, I could take it. I was so very happy that I had many more options. I heard some splashing in the creek and wondered what it was, but peer through the underbrush as much as I could not determine it, and my food plot remained empty. The winter night came on quicker and quicker, but I was determined, since I had spent so much money on this rut line, that I was going to stay. And so the night came down faster and faster, and I sat contented in my tree stand, only slightly frustrated, and laughing to myself that I had had the perfect plan foiled by the gods of the hunt.
The best laid plans of mice and men, aft gang of Glade. I wonder if Robbie Burns was a hunter. We can plan, we can scheme, and gotta laugh. But slow descent into madness continues, and the season goes on. I'm just laughing because I got outfoxed again. But that's hunting, and I still got some season yet to hunt. So if you've stuck around this long, thanks for watching. My 2 doe decoys over here, right there, tree stand, and I just took this whole fence line, every single post, all the way along the property line, and I scraped VS gel onto each post. So here's hoping. You know, I don't really think that anything in its right mind would be moving right now. But then again, I can't get a deer if I'm not in the woods. So I'm prepared for a pretty miserable evening. About 34 degrees and raining. I'm sure none of you guys care at this point, and you've already left me a troll comment shit-talking.
It was a very dreary day, the last day of November. I had hours and hours of cold, wet, windy hunting ahead of me, attempting to sit still, squinting through the misty, freezing haze, the mercury riding about 33 to 34 as the sun slowly sank and the rain came down. But every day of hunting is exactly the same, and every day of hunting is just a little bit different. I had set my decoys, set my scent line, and I was prepared to sit and wait. The rain tapped on my cowboy hat, and I forced myself not to give up. I watched my fletchings become soaked with rain and knew that if something did show up, that it would need to be close or my arrow might not fly true. After hours of sitting in the rain, something caught my attention and I could hardly make it out. My cameras were soaked and the lenses were covered in water, but it was 2 deer shaking the water from their bodies as they entered the field. The sun sank a little bit lower as I watched them. It was just 2 does, and it is my opinion that does are much harder to hunt than bucks because they have nothing that affects them. They will rarely come to a call. They will rarely come to a decoy, and they won't follow a scent line. But just on the other side of the fence, out of range, the does fed along the beans and stopped to drink at the puddle in the field. Everything was so absolutely wonderful. I had so much riding on this hunt. Another month of the season was coming to a close. I had seen deer, which was a victory. I had lasted out the elements, which was a victory. But as I walked out in the cold, misty darkness, once the Lady of the Night had wrapped her hands around the land, I reflected to myself that I would continue hunting. Nothing worth doing is ever easy. And while frustrated, I am prepared to deal with an empty season. Desperation, a feeling of futileness, and yet incredible excitement. It was a new month and a brand new day, a totally different day from the day just before. The weather was beautiful, the wind was in my face, and I was finally able to utilize the other property. I had seen deer from my other tree stand walk right past the spot I was sitting at, within 5 feet of this very spot, so many times that I have lost count. And so, sitting in the fence row with the wind in my face and my doe decoys out in the field, I was excited. But every day of hunting is exactly the same, and every day of hunting is just a little bit different. Primal emotions were stirred in me as the sun began to sink lower and lower, and the temperature rapidly approached the freezing point. I watched behind me, I watched in front of me, and everything was so absolutely perfect as I sat semi-concealed in this fence row. People trivialize hunting by saying, "Do you think that you have something to prove?" And my answer is yes, I own it. I have something to prove. That is why I hunt the way that I do. The geese were flying overhead, and everything was so beautiful as the sun set. I did not feel cheated. I had done everything that I could. I had used my decoys, I had used the wind, and I had sat until the last of the shooting light.
First day of December. Season goes on. Odds are getting longer and stakes are getting higher. Still hunting hard. None of you care at this point. But even though I'm walking out with nothing, I still think it was a perfect hunt. Perfect wind, perfect weather. The deer just were in other places. They're wild and free, majestic, uncontrollable creatures. What can I say? It's not the Pike County pornography that people expect from Illinois deer hunting. This is a pretty long shot, but it's probably just crazy enough to work. I was going to try my field set, but I've decided that I'm going to try this pine set up here by the pond. Now, it was snowing like hell at my other stand, and I thought, nothing's going to be out. I'm just going to sit there. But hopefully the snow will come here, and they'll be coming into these pine trees to bed before they go out to the hay. At least here's hoping. Or it could just be another dry night.
Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. Same primal emotions, different sights, different sounds, and always a brand new adventure. My fingers were burning from climbing the Frigid ladder. The wind was in the perfect direction, and I was prepared as best that I could for hours of miserable waiting in my tree stand. But after about 45 minutes, without any warning at all, a buck became apparent. I heard swishing in the grass. He had come in through the gate that I had left open between the fences, and he was concealed behind a pine limb. I could not get a shot, even though he was within range. He was preparing to cross the fence to my decoy when he sniffed the fence post that I had grabbed crossing and took off. The cold was irrelevant when it was time for action.
That by far is the biggest buck that I've ever seen in my entire life. He was no more than 30 yards from me. Was getting ready to cross the fence, and then all of a sudden he just took off. He might have smelled the fence post where I grabbed it with my hand. I didn't even know what to say. Like, out of nowhere.
In the alfalfa, the buck fed placidly until finally a doe crossed his path. Once they had both left, I then climbed down and I took my fence pliers and clipped the fence, bending it back, for the buck would have simply shuffled into range if he had not been stopped by the fence. The storm front was rolling in, and my hands were growing numb despite the hot hands in my muff. But I was determined that this was the last day before shotgun season. This was the only cover available, and there would be potentially deer coming through with the weather. The wind was on my face and sent stinging snowflakes into my eyes. Shivering and frustrated, stinging snow, biting wind, I sat, my breath mixed with snow frosting my mustache. Still, I was determined to remain.
Blow your fucking heart out, old man Winter. I'm Tex fucking Grebner, and I will be here until the last dog gets hung. I swear it!
There is a primal terror that arises in you when you look at your hands and tell them to move, and they do not respond the way that you would wish them to. If you have ever sat in a frigid tree stand the way that I have done, you will know why Santiago in The Old Man and the Sea speaks to his hands. This was a similar battle that I was undergoing, Hemingway-esque in its tragedy. I sat laughing at myself in the cold until I cried, but still I remained in hopes that a deer would visit my stand.
Slow descent into madness continues. I'm still hunting hard. I was closer than I've ever been to a monster buck today. And I'm still hunting. So if you're still watching, you better stay tuned. So it's early evening. I'm going in ultra light. No decoys, no tripod, just my bow with my cameras. Gonna do a ground set. Phenomenal weather, and I'm hoping they're gonna come out to this bean field.
It was my first hunt after shotgun season. Every day of hunting is exactly the same, But every day of hunting is just a little bit different. Different sights and different sounds. The same primal emotions. I was being ultra primal today. I was set up behind this brush on a hillside where deer would walk right in front of me. Everything was so absolutely perfect. Occasionally, the branches would shake from a squirrel scurrying up a tree. It was a misty dusk. And deer go where they do not get shot at. Because after the shotgun seasons conclude, everything is so shell-shocked that I did not want to try and hunt my tree stand across the field on my family's property. I was utilizing this new property where I had seen the deer. I knew that the deer bedded on the property across the field, and I would simply, in the frigid air, have to wait. I had my hands stuffed deep into a new Sitka muff so that they would not go numb. And so I watched the field with the occasional flock of Canadian geese flying overhead. Everything was just so absolutely perfect as I sat, the wind on my face, watching, waiting, and listening, hoping that a deer would come across my path. I was beginning to wonder if I had made the right decision, and then I saw a deer moving its way directly past my tree stand and making its way toward me across the field. At this moment, I experienced a predatory clarity, watching one deer, and then another deer, and then still another deer enter the field directly from where my tree stand was. The deer continued to move across the field. It was just out of range. I moved little by little off of my seat, closer and closer as the deer moved. The first deer made its way up the hillside, and I knew that it would either go very bad or very good, because eventually the deer would make its way behind me and hit my scent trail. Even though I was coated down with Evercalm, I could not take any chances. Still another deer made its way across the field and up on the hillside behind me. Closer now, but still out of range. And still I sat, my hands out of my muff, rapidly beginning to numb, as another doe and still another doe, 35 yards away from me, made their way across the field, directly from where my tree stand had been positioned. Slowly and gracefully they moved, and my heart was racing. I shifted my weight side to side in a very awkward position, trying to hold as still as I could. And then still another deer came out into the field. And then another deer. They had been hiding the shotgun season in my family's property, and now here these does were, right in front of me as the sun sank, and my fingers began to tingle. I had the trees between us, and I probably could have taken the shot, but I was not sure, and I wanted to get a little bit closer, and so I moved again, just a little closer, little by little. My heart was in my throat. The wind was perfect, but my movement as I tried to stalk closer had attracted the attention of one of the does, and I froze in a very awkward position, but all too late. And then, they made their way away from me, because after the shotgun seasons, deer become incredibly skittish. But even though I had not taken a shot, I did not regret not taking a shot that I could not be sure of.
That was absolutely crazy. Those does came right from where my tree stand is, across the field, and I'm pretty sure I'm not going to see anything else tonight, seeing as I got busted just now. And I am sure I probably could have killed one tonight, but they just weren't close enough. And I didn't feel good about it, and I'm not going to just sling an arrow. Now, if I was shooting a compound bow, it would have been a cake 30-yard shot, and I probably could have killed 2 does and tagged out before they knew what was going on. But I don't feel cheated. I did everything I could. The deer showed up. They were just too far away. And then, when I was trying to get a little closer, they busted me. Took off across the field. I figured I'm going to get packed up and hike out. But damn it, that was cool. Slow descent into madness continues. Getting closer. And I don't feel cheated, because that's just the way it goes. If you're still watching, stay tuned. I'm still hunting, but this is a pretty wild idea. I'm set up on the same hillside I was before, but in a different spot. The wind's right for it. And I'm trying to avoid my food plot stand because they started bedding over there with the hunting pressure. So I'm hoping to be able to intercept them tonight like I did the other night, but be in a better position of what trails they're going to travel. But guess what? I probably guessed wrong. So we'll see how tonight turns out. It's actually beautiful weather for December, strangely warm. Like 50 degrees out here, which normally after Thanksgiving it doesn't get above freezing for more than a day. So it's a weird night, weird plan. I'm set up behind a bush, but at least the wind's in my favor, so maybe God will feel sorry for me.
It was the type of December evening that all Midwestern whitetail hunters dream about, and yet it resembled, in stark contrast to the hand-numbing winter days that I had endured, the type of October evening that all Midwestern whitetail hunters dream about. The deer had moved into my food plot stand area, but there was no way to reach them with the creek being up, and I did not want to pressure them any more than they already had been pressured, and so set up behind this bush with trails on either side of me and green growth in the bean field. I sat, watching, waiting, and listening. The wind was in my face and everything was perfect on this unseasonably warm evening. After the gun seasons, deer become incredibly hard to hunt, and muzzleloader season was approaching. But I had achieved a certain type of peace. It no longer mattered, no matter how much I needed to validate my career, it no longer mattered if I killed a deer this year, simply because I was hunting. And there is a delicious uncertainty in hunting, because every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. And unless you are there to live it and see it and feel it, you cannot understand. But the sun sank lower and lower, and this hunt came to a close.
perfect night, beautiful weather, perfect spot. Nothing showed up. I heard a truck rattle down the road, and the deer were coughing and spooking underneath my tree stand across the field there. I was hoping that they were going to run over here, but they didn't. If you're still watching, I'm still hunting. It's December 29th. Finally got the holidays over with. I got a couple hours worth of daylight left, so I'm going to sit up here at my pine stand. Haven't had time or inclination to go hunting, so I don't know. But I swore a tearful oath that I'd be here till the last dog got hung, and it's what I intend to do. So stay tuned.
Every day of hunting is exactly the same, but every day of hunting is just a little bit different. And when I'm in the woods, it's always an adventure. And every day of hunting is always a brand new adventure. It was frigid, and my fingers were so numb from climbing the ladder that I dropped the set screw for my camera mount.
Classically me, I managed to drop the set screw while I was adjusting my camera arm, so it's free swinging. With the way that this hunt is turning out, before I've even got an arrow on my string, I may just get lucky.
Different sights, different sounds, even different smells. There was a desolation. The winter had finally come, and it had come with a vengeance. I had a good feeling that the deer might be coming to the alfalfa, or they might be coming to bed in the pine trees. The afternoon wore on, and I did see a few deer feeding in the cornfield. There were sporadic snow showers, but I had my hands stuffed deep into the Sitka muff to keep them from going numb in case there was any action. Geese called overhead, continuing their southward migration. The wind was in my face, and absolutely everything was perfect. But yet, hunting is an act of uncertainty. And as the night came down, and my season came even closer to a close, I realized that I had found an amazing peace. Even though I had not killed, I had hunted, and you have come along with me.
I wouldn't say I'm giving up, because I've had a real good run this year. But I honestly don't think I'm going to be going out much more for deer. But if you watched this far, thanks for coming out. I may be leaving empty-handed, but I don't feel cheated, because that's just the way it goes. I may have left the season empty-handed, but I learned a whole awful lot, and I'll have a better season next year, I hope, if I live to see it. So if you watched this far, stay tuned. As always, God bless all my sportsmen of America. Join the NRA to protect our rights. Please check out my friends over at legallyconcealed.org. Thank you very much to those of you involved in law enforcement, those who serve in the military. Thanks for watching Texas Grebner Outdoors.